Hello everyone. Today I'm in the German military cemetery that's located in Dagneux, France. And this is the cemetery where all the German soldiers who were killed in southeastern France during the war are buried today. So what happened is that after the war, the Germans went all around France, picked up all the bodies, dug up all the bodies and brought them to these collection cemeteries. And so this is Dagneux up here, you see. And it covers the territory of all southeastern France, including the area that I'm interested, which is the region of Nice. So this is what the cemetery actually looks like. There's a total of almost 20,000 bodies buried here. I'll just briefly explain how the cemetery is organized. After the war, the Germans had lots of dead and not much money. So if you look here, you see that actually in each grave, there's 4 guys buried. There's 2 names on this side here, and then 2 names as well on the other side. Here in one corner of the cemetery, they have what they call the Kameradengrab, so the comrades' grave, and this is where they buried all the guys that were in mass graves, and the bodies couldn't be separated from each other. When there were too many like that, then they just buried them here. So here we are in the cemetery, and let's look in details what's actually written on each gravestone. And you can see that what it says is a person's name, his rank, his date of birth, and his date of death. It's not like in American or Commonwealth cemeteries where you have the unit, and then on the other hand they don't always have the date of birth. For the German army, the date of birth was something very important, because that's how they classified their archives. You would have the guy's name and his date of birth. There wasn't a serial number and stuff like that. So see here, this guy, for example, was born in 1926. Now, I was going through the cemetery, and then I noticed this here, see? This guy here, his name is Eno Strobel, and there's no date of birth. So I wondered, what does that mean? And then I understood what it means. It means that the Germans don't actually know who's buried in this grave here, see? They were given a body, told this body is Eno Strobel, died on September 12th, 1944. And then when they looked for him in their archives, they looked for Eno Strobel, they'd never found any Eno Strobel. So they weren't able to figure out what his date of birth was, because they don't know who he is. They just have this name that corresponds to nobody, to no known dead person or missing person. So they reburied him under this name, knowing that they actually don't know who this person is. So going through the cemetery, I found a few similar cases that we're going to go and take a look at right now. So now what I'm doing is going through the cemetery, looking for these unsolved cases. Because if they're unsolved, then that means maybe if you look at them carefully, we'll actually be able to solve something, right? So here's another one here. See, the exact same story. Died in August 1944, but no date of birth. The name is Hans Kirchner. And see, this is strange. It says Hans with 2 N's, and that doesn't usually exist in German. It's just written with 1 N. So this is a kind of a hint that there might be a mistake that was made in the name, and that could maybe explain why they weren't able to figure out who this guy was. Let's continue our walk looking for these unknown guys. And over here I found one that's really interesting. Now you see what that says? As for the others, there's no date of birth written. And this guy's name is Carlo Maioli, and that does not sound German at all, and that sounds pretty suspicious as far as I'm concerned. So let's look at these 3 guys, let's investigate, let's pull out the documents, pull out the lists, see what we can figure out about all 3 of these guys. Okay, so let's go back to this first body. Now, his name you see is Eno with 1 N and Strobel with a U. And he died in September 1944. And what I didn't tell you guys as we were doing the cemetery tour is that I have all the Red Cross lists of missing soldiers, of German soldiers in southern France, and I pretty much know them off by heart because I've had them for years. And as soon as I saw this grave for Eno Strobel, I thought that reminds me of something. and it reminded me of this guy who's missing in southern France, you see? Eno with two N's, Strobel with an O. And he's missing at Mont Scandeious, which is near Nice, in September 1944. So my immediate hunch was that Strobel with O, the missing guy, and Strobel with U, the unknown guy in the cemetery, are actually the same person. But the question is, how can I prove that? How can I make a link between the two? The way I can make a link between the two is by proving that both of them not only have a similar name, but that they also died at a similar location and at a similar date. So basically I want to show that Eno Strobel and Eno Strobel died at the same place at the same time. So to start that process, let's try to figure out where Strobel with U was actually buried before being handed over to the German cemetery at Dagneux. And the way I can do that is I look at all the guys who are buried in the graves right beside him. So this is Strobel, and he's buried with these other guys on his right and left. And where did all these guys get buried? You see the burial locations are mostly Draguignan, which is in southern France, or else towns that are near Draguignan. So from this information, I suspect that Strobel, the unknown soldier in the cemetery, was buried at Draguignan. And before going further, I have to tell you what Draguignan is, because it's not just any place. Draguignan is a town in southern France, near Nice and Cannes, and it was very near the invasion beaches when the Allies landed in southern France on August 15th, 1944. And just a couple of days after the landing, they had already liberated Draguignan, and they set up several field hospitals in Draguignan. And when you set up field hospitals, of course, lots of soldiers die in them, so then you also have to have a cemetery. So the Americans also set up a major cemetery in Draguignan, and that cemetery still exists today. It's the Draguignan American Cemetery. And in these American cemeteries, you had troops from the graves registration companies. So these were US Army troops who were specially trained for identifying the dead, digging graves, organizing cemeteries. And they did their work very, very carefully. Here you can see that they're going through dead bodies to find identification tags, papers, and things like that. And if there was nothing to identify the bodies, then these graves registration guys, they would actually take fingerprints and take tooth charts, which was really the best possible standards that existed during World War II. At that time, there was no DNA. So they really made a really big effort to identify the dead with all the means that existed and that were known at the time. And what a lot of people don't realize is that these American soldiers, they didn't just bury American bodies. They buried all the bodies from the area, basically. So they buried English troops, they buried Canadian troops, they buried Italians, and they buried Germans. And here they are preparing a bunch of Germans to be buried in Draguignan Cemetery. And for the Germans, for their enemies, they were just as careful as for US troops. If the guys had no ID tags, then they would also take fingerprints and tooth charts. And here you can see there's a dead German body, and the guys from the graves registrations, see, they're taking his fingerprints. And even the German army didn't do that with its own dead. And actually it was a waste of time for the Americans to do this, because even if the body was fingerprinted, to identify the body you need something to compare it with. You need a database of fingerprints, and the Germans didn't have that. So all these fingerprints were taken for nothing. And if fingerprints were impossible, like in this case here, it says the fingerprints impossible, skin off of hands. So this body is decomposing. So on the side here where the fingerprints are supposed to be, well, they didn't put anything because they can't take them. But instead they took a tooth chart. So all this is just to say that the Americans are doing a really, really great job in these war cemeteries that they organized. Now let's get back to Eno Strobel with a U. So from my little research, I think he was probably buried in Draguignan, but I need to confirm that. So I managed to get all the lists of burials from the Draguignan American Cemetery. And sure enough, who do I find? Eno Strobel with a U. So now I have it confirmed that he was buried by US troops at Draguignan Cemetery in southern France. What you can see on this burial sheet of the US Army is that they have a column for the soldier's name, and then they have a column for the soldier's serial number, because in the US Army every soldier had a unique serial number. And with these Germans, it was very problematic for the Americans, because the Germans did not have a unique serial number. What they had was an identification tag with a unit number and then a code within the unit. And I mentioned this in another video of mine about German identification tags called What's Your Name, Soldier? So if you don't understand how German identification tags work, watch that video and then you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. So the problem here, you see, is that this Enno Strobel, he apparently did not have an identification tag when his body came in. So the Americans just wrote unknown and unknown here. And what the Germans would usually have done is they would have written the date of birth. See? But the Americans didn't use that as something for identification, so they also wrote down no date of birth. So the consequences of that is that you just have a name and no other information. And that poses two problems. The first problem is, imagine it's a very common name like John Smith. So if you have a John Smith buried with no date of birth and no serial number, then basically you have no clue who he is because there's lots of John Smiths. And the other problem is, what if there's a typo when they write down the name, if they make a mistake? Then how are you going to find the guy? Because you have no redundant information, no secondary information to figure out that a mistake occurred. And lots of mistakes occurred. Just on this sheet right here, this guy whose name is Werner, they wrote an M instead of an N. And this guy whose name is Bernhard, it ended just with a D, they wrote DT. So the Americans made lots of typos. And even with the American names, if you look at the other sheets, there's English-sounding names, whatever. There's lots and lots of mistakes. So it's important not just to rely on the name, but also to have some kind of secondary identification information. And for these Germans, sometimes there wasn't, and for Enno Strobel there wasn't, and that's a problem. Anyways, now we've figured out we were looking for two things. We're trying to show that Strobel with an O and Strobel with a U, died at the same place and at the same time. Now we know that Strobel with an O is missing at Mont Scandeious near Nice in September 1944. And we know that Strobel with a U is buried in Draguignan, which is in the vicinity of Mont Scandeious. So the location matches. Now what about the date of death? We already know that both of them died in September, but could we be more precise? Enno Strobel disappeared at Mont Scandeious in September 1944. Okay, well that's interesting because I know that at Mont Scandeious, the only known fighting that happened exactly there happened on September 11th, 1944. And actually we know specifically what happened because an American who was involved wrote and detailed what happened. And basically a little American patrol went to Mont Scandeious, was ambushed by the Germans, 2 men were killed. And the medic went forward to help the wounded Americans or killed Americans. And the Germans let him go back to his lines because he was a medic. And for some reason, they let a German soldier go back with him. And as soon as they got back to the American lines, the Americans shot at the German soldier and they wounded him. And here the medic describes that the German was wounded in the abdomen and then he put a bandage on him. All this shows that if Strobel with an O is missing at Mont Scandeious, he's probably missing on September 11th, 1944. And this could actually very well be him who was wounded in this exact action, because this wasn't Stalingrad where millions of people were dying. This was in southern France. There was just little skirmishes, a couple of prisoners, a couple of killed, stuff like that. And chances are very high that this German, since he was wounded and captured, could very well be Enno Strobel. So let's summarize the information. We have Strobel with an O missing at Mont Scandeious, probably on September 11th, 1944. And then Strobel with a U, buried on September 12th, 1944 in Draguignan. And if we imagine that Enno Strobel was that wounded soldier, then what would the Americans have done? Of course, they would have sent him to the hospital in Draguignan. So basically, this information matches extremely well, and I'm convinced that both guys are the same, that Strobel and Strobel are one single person, and that there's just a typo when his name was written. So to confirm this, I contacted the German authorities and sent them all my information. And they have the Enno Strobel with an O's file, so the missing guy. And the file confirms what I suspected, you see. He's missing in Mont Scandeious on September 11th, the date that I had guessed, thanks to the historical information I have. Okay, so now we know that both Strobels died in a similar place at a similar date. And the German authorities looked at that and they said, you're correct, these people are the same, so we consider him officially identified. Enno Strobel with a U is actually Enno Strobel with an O. It's just a problem of how the name was written at the time. This here is the email I received that confirmed that the guy is now officially identified and that they're going to write his full name onto the grave. And I also contacted Enno Strobel's family members, and this is what I found out. So Enno Strobel was from a family of 3 brothers, and all 3 of the brothers were killed during World War II. And then after the war, a 4th brother was born, and he's still alive today, and he's the one I'm in contact with. And he showed me that actually after the war, the family received Enno Strobel's personal papers from the US Army. See, it says returning funds of a prisoner of war, and they also specify the prisoner is deceased. So the family never knew what happened to Strobel's body, but ironically, they actually received his personal documents from the US Army. So I guess nobody connected the dots at the time. Nobody understood that if the US Army was sending back Strobel's documents, it means that he must have died and be buried in a US Army cemetery. So they could have, looked over lists and stuff, but I guess at the time it just wasn't possible to do all that. A lot of this information that I'm showing you was classified for years and years, of course. And one of the documents the family received back is Enno Strobel's paybook. And this is very neat because it helps you understand how the Americans could have made a mistake when they wrote down his name on the Draguignan list. The first mistake they made is that they wrote Strobel instead of Strobel. And you can see that this is all written by hand, so it would be easy to confuse this O with a U. And then, even more neat, you see that Enno, according to the document, is written with only 1 N, but then when Enno signs his name, he signs it with 2 N's. So you can't really blame the Americans for having made a mistake with the number of N's, since even the Germans on 2 different pages of their own ID document didn't get it properly. That's the first case, and so he's officially identified now. Let's take a look at the second one. Hans Kirchner. So he's written Hans with 2 N's, and he died on August 21st, 1944. So now we know the music. We can imagine what the problem is. Probably some kind of typo, probably something to do with the Draguignan. So I go through my lists of Draguignan burials, and sure enough, I find that Hans Kirchner was buried at Draguignan Cemetery, and you see he was buried with no ID tag. So the same issue as Enno Strobel. There's only a name, no date of birth, no other information, which makes it complicated to make a link, And then I go and look at my list of Red Cross missing soldiers, and sure enough, I find Johann Kirchner missing in Cannes, which is in southern France, in August 1944. And for your information, Hans is a nickname for Johann. So we actually have a guy who has basically the same name, who died in the same area and at approximately the same date. This time, to confirm the date and location, I contacted the German archives and asked for a copy of Kirchner's file immediately. And this is the information from the German file. According to them, the last news they have is that he is missing for them on August 18th, 1944, in a village called Kalyan. And let's take a look at that on the map. So, Kalyan is here. We know Johann Kirchner disappeared there, or has been missing there since August 18th, 1944. I also know that this town was liberated by the American paratroopers on August 20th. And on August 21st, 1944, we have Hans Kirchner, who dies and is buried in Draguignan. So in my opinion, this is another case of it being the exact same soldier. Everything matches, there's just a little problem with the first name. So I sent all this information to the German authorities, but I haven't heard back yet. And I also contacted the family. And the family sent me this picture of Johann Kirchner. And on the back of the picture, it says Johann Kirchner, born in December 1926. That means he was 17 years old at the time of his death. And then what they wrote really kind of broke my heart, you see. It says here that he's still missing today. And when I saw that, I figured I can't just wait around for this guy to be officially identified, This brother is an old man. He could die any day, and I have to tell him what I found, even if it's not official yet. So I told him that his brother was probably buried with a mistake in his name in Dagneux Cemetery, and he was very, very thankful for that. And I'm just hoping now that in the future, in a few months or something, I'll get an email from Germany confirming that he's officially identified as well. Now let's take a look at the third body, Carlo Maioli. So he's not identified by the Germans, no date of birth. And what's the first thing that anybody can conclude reading this name is that this guy must not be German, he must be an Italian. So what I did, I went to the database of all Italians killed during World War II. And there's only one guy called Carlo Maioli who died during World War II. And guess what? He died on August 15th, 1944 in France. So the exact same information as the Carlo Maioli in the Dagneux Cemetery. I asked for a copy of his military file and they sent it to me. And the file says that Carlo Maioli, he died as a prisoner of war in France from ill treatments. So he was actually a prisoner of the Germans and he died of ill treatments according to this file on August 15th, 1944. So I suspect that this is another Draguignan typo problem, a Graves registration typo problem. And I go to my Draguignan lists, and sure enough, who do I find? Carlo Maioli. Now look at this. This is really an illustration of the kinds of typos that happened. So you see here it says that Carlo Maioli is buried as an enemy Italian dead. And he was buried, and the Americans were just organizing themselves. So just after a few days, they actually exhumed his bodies and a bunch of other bodies and reburied them at a separate location. And when they buried him a second time, they made a new list. So here Carlo Maioli is a dead Italian. And then when we look at the reburial, now all of a sudden, he's not Italian anymore. It doesn't say he's Italian. He's just buried amongst a bunch of Germans as a German. And usually they would have written Italian here in between brackets, but somebody forgot to do it. And the consequence of that is that after the war, the body was handed over to the Germans. The Germans brought him to Dagneux Cemetery. And they just treated the body as if it was a German, and nobody figured, we can't find him as a German, maybe we should take a look and contact the Italians and see if he might be Italian. And nobody did that. So I contacted the Italian government about this. And this shows you the kind of difficulty that solving these things is. I sent them a picture of the grave, I sent them all the information, I said, your guy is buried in the German cemetery in Dagneux. And instead of saying thank you or something, or we're going to look into this, they just say, the documents you're asking for are reserved for administrative uses, You can't have access to these documents. So I replied to them, I'm not asking you for any documents, I'm telling you that your guy is buried in Dagneux Cemetery. And then they understood what I'm trying to tell them. And you see they send these emails with no signature, nothing, so you don't even know who's writing to you. If you contact them again in a few months, you don't even know who you were communicating with. And they concluded by saying, as far as we see, this Carlo Maioli is buried in his hometown at Sant'Angelo. So they conclude that the grave in the German cemetery must be a kind of memorial stone in his name. And I don't know if you realize how utterly stupid that is. He was an enemy of the Germans. The Germans, as you saw, were putting 4 names on every gravestone to save space and to save money. And why on earth would they write an Italian guy's name in the middle of their cemetery, an Italian who they didn't even manage to identify? It just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So my next step was to contact his family. I didn't manage to do that on my own, but I had help from a group of guys called the Italian Recovery Team, who have been really friendly and very helpful with me. And they were able to find the family within a couple of days. And the family said that they have no information about him being buried in his hometown, of course. And they thought that he had been buried in a mass grave in France somewhere. And they were very happy to find out that he's actually buried in a German cemetery under his name. And they're pretty happy with that. They don't want the body brought back to Italy or something. The important thing is that this guy is buried under his name in a grave and his family knows where he is. Now you can see, I'm a French guy and I'm contacting the governments of the former enemies of France, so Germany and Italy. And you see they respond to me. Sometimes it takes a while, but they respond, and the Germans actually took in my information and said, yeah, you're right, we're going to identify this guy. And of course it's very rewarding for me to be able to communicate like this with the governments of former enemy countries. And especially it's in sharp and very disappointing contrast with what I try to do when I communicate with the French authorities. Now, I made a video a couple of months ago called Whose Unknown Body X77. If you haven't seen it and enjoyed this video, then you should watch it because it's something very similar. And basically, I managed to figure out that two French resistance guys who were missing since 1944 are actually buried as unknown soldier, one in the US cemetery in Draguignan and one in a French cemetery. And I sent my file to the French authorities. For one of the guys, the information is extremely clear. He died at the same day, at the same place, with the same wounds. And these French authorities, they dared to reply. First of all, they took 4 years to reply. And then they dared to say, you know, this information doesn't bring anything new. It's not convincing. We shouldn't exhume these old bodies. DNA might not work for them. So basically, they just looked for a bunch of excuses not to do their jobs. Their response was in complete bad faith. And you can imagine how frustrating that is to see that in France today. It's easier, much easier to identify the former enemies than it is to identify actual French people who participated in the liberation of France. It's absolutely frustrating, and it's an absolutely disgraceful situation. So to conclude this video, we can see that these three guys remained unidentified for 80 years because of typos, literally because of typos, because of a little mistake in a name, a letter missing, or just forgetting to write down a nationality. And they were buried by Americans. They were the enemy, but the Americans they tried to do their best. They really did the best they could, the best standards that existed at the time. But because of, let's say, bad luck and difference in the ways that the German army and American army organized their archives, the guys just ended up being missing for all these years. And another thing that's important to say is that, you see, these guys, even though the authorities knew about them, they remained unidentified. And I'm just a local historian, but because I have this local knowledge and all the documents that concern my region, I managed to connect dots that nobody else could connect. So the message here is that local historians can make connections that other people can't, that somebody in Berlin or Washington cannot make. Our knowledge is important, and the authorities should let us help identify bodies and help. The authorities should let us help in these kinds of cases. Another thing that's important to say is that, you know, you saw I showed you my Excel databases, and those are such powerful tools. They're boring to make, they look boring, but it's things like that can help you connect, you know, different databases. A guy that's missing in one place is listed in another place, so these databases are ultra important for research. And finally, I'd just like to say that now when I walk through this cemetery, I mean, I feel really proud that I managed to help identify just a few of these guys. But I know I brought closure to the families, and that's such a huge reward. It makes all the time spent doing all this research really worthwhile. Now, if any of you guys are working on similar World War II research projects, you can always contact me if you think I can help you at this email address. And to end the video, I'd just like to say thank you to a few people, especially the Italian recovery team who helped me contact the family of Carlo Maioli. Thank you also to local French historian Paul Maioli for some documents, and to the family of US soldier Clarence Gisler. I hope you enjoyed this video, and have a nice day, guys.